Hello, everyone. My name is Castillo Soto, and for today's podcast, I share with you a conversation I had with Dr. Francesca Sobande about her book titled Big Brands Are Watching You, Marketing, Social Justice, and Digital Culture, published by University of California Press in 2024. Dr. Sobande is a lecturer at the University of Cardiff in Wales, and her research interests span the power and politics of media and the marketplace, the digital remix culture and music, Black diasporas and archives, Black feminism and pop culture, nostalgia and subcultures, creative work and education, brands and crisis, and the internet and cultural memory, just to mention a few. Before working as a university lecturer, Dr. Sobande worked in a range of communications roles in higher education, the arts, and the nonprofit sector. She is the author of various influential works, being some of them Consuming Crisis, Commodifying Care, and COVID-19, published by Sage in 2022, The Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020. She is also co-author with Leal Roxanne Hill of the work titled Black Code Here, Black Lives in Scotland, published by Bloomsbury in 2022. And for more information about her other work, I will leave the link to her webpage in the description of this podcast. The book we discuss for this podcast is titled Big Brands Are Watching You, and it is based on a transnational research that Dr. Sobande conducts, touching upon different concepts, questions, and themes present in the marketplace. Dr. Sobande defines and challenges these concepts and ideas using a bricolage methodology, which she explains during our conversation, and providing the readers with examples from exhibitions in London, brand stores in Amsterdam, a musical festival in Vegas, and archives in Washington, D.C., and others. The aim of this episode is to provide listeners with a conversation on marketing, corporate culture, influencer cultures, and other important themes around the realm of brands from a critical perspective. Dr. Sobande's analysis is fundamental for understanding the highly interconnected and mediatized world in which we live today. I hope that listeners find our conversation useful and that it probes interesting questions from which to depart from.
This episode is part of the EUTERPE podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective.
For the first question, I would like to know how the experience of writing this book was for you. You conducted extensive research, interviewed participants, applied surveys, visited art exhibitions, among others. So could you talk about your methodology, the experience of writing the book itself, and some of the results that you came across? Was there something that surprised you or something that was unexpected?
Thanks very much for both that question and for inviting me to have this conversation with you today. And thanks again for making the time to read the book and just sort of share thoughts about the themes in it. And it's been wonderful to learn more about your own research as well. I think I'll start by speaking a bit about the methodology. So in the book, I think I describe it as a bricolage approach, which is basically my way of saying it ended up being work that was based on various different research methods. Some of them were methods that I knew at the start of the project I wanted to make use of, things like research interviews with people who work in media, marketing, and communications roles in different industries. But other methods were ones that really sort of arose as a result of serendipity and just the different ways that life moves unexpectedly and otherwise. So I didn't, at the beginning of the project, anticipate that I'd be able to access some of the archives that I ended up going to. And that was partly because of the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that a lot of physical spaces were closed for quite a long time, understandably. So, for example, being able to look at archive material in Washington, D.C. around the history of advertising and marketing and the different ways that social movements have and haven't been a part of that was something that I really hadn't thought of initially. And getting to go to the Library of Congress and Smithsonian archives and really sort of spend time looking at clippings and old black and white photos and sort of, I guess, think about the historical context that surrounds the present day was a chance to do something that I really relished, but also I guess it was both reflective of the different ways that changes in life that you don't anticipate. So in this case, the archives opening back up again. It was both reflective of how that means that research can change and how that means that writing can change, as well as sort of, I guess, being an example, to me anyway, of the importance of us looking back to the past whilst trying to deal with the present. And I say that because increasingly I'm spending more time with archives, whether it's an online archive or an in-person archive, because so often what we're looking at in the here and now and what's going on is a continuation of things that have happened in the past, even if it's manifesting in different ways. So I often use the word messy when I speak about the work that I do, or sort of organised chaos. And I know that some people think in very linear ways, or some people expect a book, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, to have this beginning, middle and end story, or to focus on sort of one very clear and defined topic. And I don't think that I tend to sort of think or write or work or live in that way. So something else I'd say around the way I've approached this work is sort of dealing with the interconnected nature of different issues, be those issues to do with activism, issues to do with inequality, issues to do with influencer culture and consumer culture. I wouldn't say that I'm joining dots, because many other people have looked at these matters in the ways that they overlap. But I guess I feel that my work's often trying to sort of grapple with the messiness of life rather than pretend that things are more compartmentalized and disconnected than they really are.
Yeah, I can totally see how this interconnection plays an important role in the book because, as you say, you bring so many different topics into the discussion that it also surprised me when I was reading about it, because it comes from something as, let's say, contemporary as social media, but then, as you mentioned, also archives and history. So it feels that you take into consideration so many aspects that it really helps to read it and understand the overall situation of the topic that you're dealing with. So it is a really nice organized chaos, as you call it.
Thank you. And I'd also just add, I'm really appreciative of the support and guidance from Michelle Lipinski at University of California Press, who'd approached me and asked if I had any ideas around sort of work to do with digital culture. And really, it was that conversation that led me on the journey of sort of thinking through the sorts of matters that ended up in the book. So just sort of to go back to your question around what was the writing process, I hadn't set out to write this book until receiving an encouraging email from Michelle and having a conversation. And I think something else that was at the root of the writing process, or just the root of the sorts of things I wrote about, was my preoccupation with questions to do with looking. And so, gazing, being gazed at, watching and being watched. It's something that, whether it's focusing on popular music or advertising and marketing or TV and film, it's just something that I'm often thinking about or looking at. And yeah, I think were it not for having had the chance to speak with Michelle and sort of gather my thoughts at that point in time, I don't think I would have ever ended up working on the book in the first place. So I wanted to really sort of mention that, because there's so many people involved in a writing process. And even if there's just a single author whose name's on the cover, there are so many others who are part of what brings that book to life.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning it. And yeah, I agree with you, because it did feel when I was reading your book that the looking and the gazing, right? That it's not only about the marketplace or when you are going to buy a product, but it is everywhere in our daily lives now. So to have, I guess, that critical vision towards what we consume or even what we produce, it is definitely important to take into consideration that it is all around us in the end. I would like to go now a bit more into concepts that you touch upon in the book. There are a lot of interesting concepts, and we, of course, don't have time to go into all of them. But, for example, you mentioned woke washing, cancel culture, culture wars, just to mention a few. But there was one that really caught my attention, which is the one on racial capitalism. I thought it was very interesting, and I had not heard it before. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the concept, how it is reflected in your methodology, in your research, just to inform our listeners about what racial capitalism is from your perspective as an expert on the topic.
Thank you. I guess I would say I always question well, we could have a longer conversation around the idea of like expertise and experts, but I guess I would say I'm always learning about different conceptualizations of racial capitalism, and I guess there are so many different people whose work I've turned to, and that includes the work of Cedric Robinson around this, the work of people such as Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Angela P. Harris, and there is so much brilliant work, whether it's from the Black radical tradition or critical race legal theory, that is essentially, without reducing the depth and complexity of it, dealing with the various ways that racism and colonialism, xenophobia, different forms of interlocking oppression are absolutely front and center of capitalism. So what I would say is, in the book, I'm looking at how at the root of capitalism is, anti-blackness, is colorism, are these different forms of power dynamics that are sometimes in other situations treated as though they exist separately from each other. And when it's applied to, for example, looking at the branding campaign of a particular organization, what that might mean is thinking not only about how they're trying to pursue profit or how they are trying to, let's say, to use their language, target a particular consumer demographic. It might also mean thinking about how the specifics of the histories of colonialism, racism, and the genocidal actions of governments are implicated in not only the content of that campaign, but perhaps a product or service that is being pushed, where it's being pushed, and also whose work and labour that is dependent upon, not only in relation to people involved in the creation of marketing representations and media, but also the people who are creating the materials or sourcing the materials for the product that is maybe being promoted. So if I was to try and summarize racial capitalism in a sentence, it almost feels like a futile task because I think we can lose a lot when we try to make things, let's say, punchy or resemble more of a soundbite and then sort of a thesis. But if I was to try and summarize it briefly, I would say it's dealing with, to draw on the work of Patricia Hill Collins, the matrix of domination. So the different ways that oppression, including but not limited to racism and colonialism, the different ways that is pushed by and through capitalism, and the ongoing impacts of that in different places and on different people.
Yeah, I understand what you say. It is so hard to just give one meaning to such an elaborate concept, right? But I do think it is really helpful because I guess that not everyone is used to putting all of these together, because sometimes people think of capitalism and then separately they think about racism and colonialism. So the fact that in your book you explicitly say how capitalism is influenced by racism and colonialism and all these different aspects that you're mentioning, right? Like whose labor does it depend on, or whose profit is the one that companies want, the language they use, who is being targeted when they create their branding campaigns. It really helped me understand the racial capitalism concept in a more substantial way. The way you explain it and the examples that you give in your book, they're really helpful to see how embedded all these concepts are in the end.
Thank you. And if it's useful, because I know that sometimes I feel like I can have a tendency to sort of think or communicate in abstract ways, or I don't know, I enjoy playing with words in lots of different ways that may or may not be as clear to people as they feel as though they are to me. So I guess another specific example that comes to mind and connects to, current discussions to do with AI is the fact that the environmental and social impacts of AI disproportionately impact people in parts of the world that are still dealing with the ongoing effects of colonialism and racism, the sorts of issues to do with injustice that we're speaking about. And also when we look at who tends to be doing different types of work, that AI is dependent on. And I say AI, artificial intelligence, in quotation marks, because what do we mean by intelligence when we're often dealing with, these different examples of, anything but. Well, when we're speaking about AI, or when we're looking critically at AI, it means we also need to be thinking critically about the fact that there are, many folks who are dealing with the impacts of being incarcerated, or dealing with the impacts as Black, Brown and Indigenous people of colonialism and genocide, racism, and who might be involved in forms of work and labour and that are sort of drawn on by big tech, and also the different parts of the world, whether it is within a specific country. If we take the US as an example, in different Black neighbourhoods where the quality of the air is clearly being affected and eroded as a result of huge data centres and the sort of the many different forms of the many different materials and resources drawn on and used as a result of the functioning of AI. All of these, I would say, are examples of racial capitalism, because if we discuss AI as only sort of connected to issues to do with, issues to do with work and labour without also speaking about race and class, we lose sight of the fact that more often than not it is Black, Brown and Indigenous and working class people in different parts of the world, including those most negatively impacted by colonialism, who are facing the worst repercussions or effects of the push of AI. So I just wanted to mention that as another example, because although it's not something I discuss at length in the book, AI is so many places, and AI is part of the day-to-day for so many people. And to bring it back to racial capitalism, AI is one of many issues that is reflective of racial capitalism in motion.
I think that it is the best example that you could have given, because as you say, even though you do not touch upon it at length in your book, it has been in the past couple of months a very common topic that I have discussed with my friends about the use of AI and how it has become such an everyday tool that people use for the most basic things. And whenever I question people about this exact use of resources and who's getting the benefits by the use of the tool, most people don't even know or don't even consider it. So it is very interesting that you give this example, because I think that it is something that we should be thinking about from a very critical perspective, and especially from the racial capitalism concept that you just introduced.
And yeah, it might seem like a tangent, but as we keep saying, everything's connected. But I think sort of part of that includes discussions to do with, equality, diversity, or equity, diversity and inclusion. And I know, many people, many organizations will focus on inclusivity in relation to different languages or different ways of translating work. And I say that because there are times when people are turning to different tools that draw on AI to translate work, and perhaps on the basis of what they feel are EDI goals, is an intention to make work more inclusive, but as a result is undermining not only the work of translators and their work and labour rights, but is also potentially, again, contributing to the environmental destruction that is impacting the very people who they might be claiming to try and sort of bring into a conversation or speak to and with. So I just think, there are so many examples around AI that, again, bring things back to racial capitalism. And for that, with that example, also makes me think about tensions between what might be viewed as EDI work as opposed to more liberationist oriented work that says, if this idea of inclusion is at the cost of supporting translators, is at the cost of the environment that people live in, is this really inclusion at all, or what values is your notion of equality, equity, diversity and inclusion based on, if you're not turning your attention to these bigger picture matters?
I think this is also a very nice transition into my next question, because it touches on the topic of morality, which is one of the main topics in your book. To me, again, this was very interesting to read, because it is a topic that has been at the back of my head but I have not been dealing with it in my research directly. So it was really interesting to question even my own choices based on that sense of morality that is put out by brands and big corporations. And to me, one of the main questions that I had for you is related to what one of your participants mentions. And I'm going to quote, this person says, brands just throw out these hashtag this, hashtag that, picture this, picture that. And it's like, wait a minute, great, but are you actually doing work to contribute to social change? And I end the quote here. You talk a lot about this, about how big corporations take a side or a stance on a certain topic, and then they move depending on their own interests, or how real can that stance be when a corporation is made by so many different people, right? So I wanted you to share with our listeners first the idea of morality and the politics of morality that you discuss in your book, and also these brands' moral imposition that you propose that could help us understand this topic a little bit better.
To start with the first part of the question around different ideas of morality, I'm also sort of going to connect this back to your first question around the writing and research process. So something that happened during the time was the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the US. So that was the overturning of the landmark decision that had brought forth the right I say the right, but there are always exceptions to every rule. We know that people's ability to access rights is unequally distributed, but the right for women to be able to access abortions in the US. So the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the erosion of that right happened during the process of working on this book, which was one of the reasons why I ended up sort of turning to certain archives and looking at different issues that I hadn't thought about as much at the beginning of the process around reproductive justice and so on. And I think that what we've seen in the time since then is what we've seen, let's say, over the last 3 to 5 years in the US as a whole. So also since the re-election of Trump and what people have been referring to as the rollback of EDI or DEI efforts, or what people such as scholar Victor Ray has been looking at in terms of segregationist actions to really name explicitly the nature of oppression. I think all of that highlights the different ways that ideas to do with morality are struggled over and are sort of reflected or are reinforced in different marketplace settings. So something that has shifted, I would say, since I started working on this book and since the book was published is there are many brands who at that point in time had issued certain statements, for example, around it in response to Black Lives Matter, or around it in response to overturning Roe v. Wade, expressing certain commitments or putting forward certain ideas that might be viewed as social justice oriented, who now have shifted, pivoted, sort of either quietly moved away or quite overtly sort of pedaled back in light of the re-election of Trump and in response to the changing political landscape. And I think all of that speaks to this question around morality and the fact that, you know, what is or isn't moral is socially constructed. It's never fixed. It's dependent on whose point of view we're dealing with. But specifically when we're dealing with brands, their position, their perspective, what they might refer to as their purpose, can change almost overnight in response to what is going on socially, politically, and perhaps most importantly to them economically, which is always impacted by the others. Something that I write about in the book is sort of the relationship between notions of morality and ethics, so not treating them as interchangeable, and certainly to sort of bring in critical race legal theory, looking beyond what is just written in law. So too often people will treat what is legal as sort of the center of notions of morality or sort of a moral compass. And again, people might say, you know, as long as it is legal, it is ethical. As long as it is legal, it is moral, or viewing anything that is illegal as immoral, as unethical. But something that I reflect on in the book is the fact that throughout history, who hasn't been viewed as human has always reflected a whole host of issues of oppression, inequality, ableism, racism, Islamophobia, and so on. which means that for me, when we're dealing with morality, we have to be acknowledging that and pushing back against a simplistic assumption that the law defines what isn't moral, or who is or isn't capable of even making moral judgments. And the second part of the question around the notion of brands' moral impositions, when I'm writing about that, I'm thinking about both the different ways that brands might feel as though ideas to do with morality are imposed on them, whether that's demands made by people, politicians, organizations, whole countries, so to speak, or sort of pressures that are pushed by other brands in certain sectors and spaces. So I speak a little bit about, the sort of side-to-side pressures between brand competitors or brands that might collaborate as part of mutually beneficial approaches, whether that's a brand like Tony's Chocolonely and Ben and Jerry's. But we can also think about brands' moral impositions as sometimes being the ideas or sort of the ideological approaches that they may be pushed towards us. And I suppose with that term, I was playing with different ways that the positions of brands have been discussed. And I was also trying to grapple with the fact that, there are all these different power dynamics at play. And I think more often than not, there is quite limited discussion of how brands will jostle between each other. If we bring it to the more contemporary moment, I think there's a lot we could speak about in the context of the US around moral impositions with regards to brands who are pushing back against, sort of this directive to not have anything to do with DEI, to scrub certain words from their websites. We've seen, whole grants being removed simply because they were in support of Black folks. They were to support work done by women, or they were to support initiatives that address transphobia and are sort of foregrounding trans liberationist work. And I think, with those sorts of examples, it makes clear that brands, no matter how much they might claim to hold certain values, they can shift very quickly and they can switch things up very swiftly when they feel that their profit margins are under threat. And that really just sort of exposes the reality that the ground upon which they claim is sort of strong and stable, or the strength of their convictions that they might suggest when posting a black square during the summer of 2020, it's very fragile and it's very much self-motivated, as opposed to being about a collective vision or a liberationist mindset.
Which is also very scary at the same time, I think, right?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is I don't disagree, but brands were never going to save us. And I think a thread perhaps throughout the book and throughout quite a lot of my work is this idea of, I guess, thinking beyond binaries. So, brands aren't these sort of faceless entities, and as that quote that you read gets to, brands are made up of the work of people. So I wouldn't want to suggest that I'm sort of picturing this autonomous institution that's completely disconnected from humans. But at the same time, when we're speaking about commercial brands, or we're speaking about sort of institutions, they were never going to be any sort of magic solution to the structural issues to do with inequality and injustice that we're dealing with. That said, to your point, I think it is still very scary to be confronted with what we're witnessing right now. But what I'm always, I guess, heartened by is the fact that people are always finding a way to push back against and struggle together, despite the realities of the number of institutions who really will just go where the money is, and will very quickly reverse any sort of commitment, no matter how small it was, that they once made.
Which then becomes more hopeful, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And also I think one of the things that I write a little bit around in the book is sort of this idea of like the hopeful and generative nature of critique, and sort of to take that a step further and draw on the work of people such as, Stuart Hall and Stuart Hall's incredible work around also critique as being part of the movement towards action. So too often, unfortunately, critique can sort of sit at this level of like abstract ideas or theory for theory's sake. But critique can be hopeful, and critique can be part of action in practice. And yeah, like you said, I think it's holding on to hope, but also it's thinking like, what can we do with that hope that can have some material and meaningful impact in terms of trying to work towards a better world.
Yeah, which is actually, I think, one of my favorite quotes from your book when you write, and I quote, "To me, critique is generative, critique is hope," end of quote. Because when I read that, it also made me question my own role in academia, right? And what we do as researchers. As you say, sometimes these ideas may feel a bit of abstract, but at the end of the day, it can also take a movement towards action. So when I feel like scared or a very small piece of the big puzzle, or confronted by really big companies or brands, I think that critique is what gives me hope again, which is why I love these quotes so much. And I wanted also to ask you how you feel after having publishing this book in such a relevant topic. And yeah, again, such a topic that feels that it's everywhere all the time, because we get so much input from companies and brands that it's on our everyday life, right? So I don't know, how do you feel after having done all this research and publishing this work? And as you say, the book was just published and some things already shifted, right? Everything changes so fast.
Yeah, I think I feel like with everything is like you're always processing it, right? So it's like I think that's partly why like the concept of conclusions and concluding chapters, like they're an illusion. Do you know what I mean? There might be a final sentence, there might be a final full stop or period mark, but it's all ongoing. But I suppose something that I have thought a lot about, and I believe this was from an interview with the person who chose the pseudonym Amanda, if memory serving me right. Amanda spoke a lot around the different ways that social ideas to do with social justice or equality, and certainly in the US and the UK anyway, are sort of framed through a lens that tends to reinforce whiteness, and also a lens that is sort of Eurocentric, Anglo-US centric. And one of the examples Amanda spoke about was mentioning different brands who had put forward initiatives to raise funds in support of Ukraine and to address different issues around Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But Amanda was sort of posing questions around where was potentially comparable care consideration in relation to different people elsewhere in the world. So Amanda spoke about different examples and sort of asked, where is people's concern around the people of Yemen, the people of Palestine, and really sort of stressed the fact that what we refer to as social justice in the US and the UK in certain situations anyway tends to be these notions of justice or these notions of morality that are really not involving any sort of substantial engagement with the oppression of people who are dealing with the interconnected nature of Islamophobia, racism, colorism, xenophobia, settler colonialism. And I've just thought a lot about Amanda's words, because that conversation with Amanda was a number of years ago, before many of the moments we've seen whereby different brands have been completely silent around Palestine, or different organizations have very punitively responded to individuals and organizers and activists, sort of calling out and denouncing genocide. And yeah, I just think often of that discussion with Amanda and the horrible atrocities that have occurred since then, whilst also spending a lot of time thinking about AI as we've discussed. So one of the things I sort of reflect on towards the end of the book is that we're increasingly seeing these sort of AI and CGI, computer generated imagery, and virtual influencers, whether that is these creations that are positioned as models, as actors, as singers. And I say that, some of the pushback against celebrity culture at large might mean that we'll see a bit of a move away from the personification of these CGI virtual creations, less of an emphasis on their sort of voice or so-called personality and more of a focus on the visual. But what I would say is that space just continues to expand, which is something I thought would happen, but perhaps not necessarily at the rate or in the ways that we are seeing. And yeah, I continue to have questions around all of that. And I continue to look critically at the fact that quite a few of those high-profile CGI virtual AI influencers are ones who are racialized as Black, as Asian, or often as multiracial or biracial or mixed race, depending on the sort of terms that are used in the space where they're created. So that also leaves me with a lot of thoughts around how digital technology is implicated in ideas to do with race, racism, identity, and also what it means to increasingly see brands turn to these artificial renderings and representations of Black people as a way to both present themselves as diverse, but also arguably as a way to avoid actually working with, hiring, or trying to meaningfully address issues that impact Black people, and more than that, issues to do with anti-Blackness, white supremacy, racism, and all the many different forms of oppression that are, right there staring us in the face at any given moment.
Hopefully some of those ideas might turn into a second book in this topic. Thank you so much, Francesca. These were basically the questions that I had for you today. I don't know if there's something else that you would like to add or something we didn't touch upon that you would like to mention before we close it.
I just wanted to say thanks again for the chance to speak about this. And yeah, I guess maybe the last thing I would say is I'm someone who I think I'll always be writing in some sort of way. I love writing for all that it there isn't a moment in any writing process where I'm not sort of questioning why am I choosing to do this. But I also, as much as I love writing, increasingly I'm finding myself turning to different ways of, I guess, like making things or sharing things or thinking through things. So photography, there's some photography woven throughout the book, but I'm wanting to spend, I guess, more time working with photography and sort of bringing in some of my own different types of art, and also just thinking more about poetry and creative forms of writing, and in looking at the different things that I tend to turn my attention to. So I think I say that because I also wanted to just sort of end by emphasizing, I think, the importance of creativity and imagination in addressing and facing the sorts of issues that we've discussed today. And there are many people, including Ruha Benjamin, who've written about the vital nature of creativity and imagination, to move towards the sorts of liberationist goals that people might have, and to challenge and refuse the fascist and oppressive systems and states that we're dealing with. So yeah, I guess the last thing I wanted to just sort of mention is the importance of art in everything, the importance of supporting people to have the space to imagine, and that doesn't mean sort of romanticizing art and imagination and dreaming in a way that overlooks the reality that there are lots of reasons why people aren't able to do that, or aren't able to do it in a way that is enriching for them. But I just wouldn't want us to lose sight of that in a conversation around oppression, particularly at a point in time when we're seeing the arts and humanities decimated, and we're seeing archives and libraries censored, and we're seeing institutions, governments working very hard to try and prohibit people from imagining and knowing that things can and will be otherwise.
I completely agree. It is a very important topic to bring into the discussion. Thank you so much for bringing it up. Also, as a feminist, I know that alternative methodologies and alternative ways of doing things are also the paths that sometimes guide us into the important work that from a capitalist perspective might not be as important. But yeah, thank you so much, Francesca, for your time. Thank you so much for doing this with me. It has been really fun. I really enjoyed reading your book and having this conversation with you. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks again. And I really appreciate the conversation, and yeah, just the chance to speak more with you. And I'm looking forward to getting to do it again sometime soon.
I want to thank Dr. Francesca Sobande for agreeing to participate in this podcast and for her guidance and support during my own PhD journey. I hope the listeners enjoyed our conversation and that they feel drawn to check out her amazing work. Big Brands Are Watching You can be purchased online through the University of California Press website and other online bookstores as well. I invite you to also visit EUTERPE's website, where I published a book review of Dr. Sobande's book. I will leave the link in the description, and thank you so much for listening, and until next time.
This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.